our first speaker, which will be Stefan Ihrig. Stefan is the director of the Center of German and European Studies at Haifa University of Haifa. He works just on various aspects of European and Middle Eastern history with a special interest in transnational issues, as well as in the history of discourses, perceptions, and political ideas. His most recent book is Justifying Genocide, Germany and Armenians from Bismarck to Hitler, published at Harvard University Press in 2016. And another one of his previous books, Ataturk in the Nazi Imagination, published in 2014, received an official recommendation in the 2013 Frankel Prize competition of the Wiener Library for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide. Stefan is also one of the editors of the Journal of Holocaust Research, also published by the University of Haifa. His topic today will be learning from the Turks, interwar Germany, the Nazis, and the quest for violent solutions.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I hope you can hear me. My dear colleagues, dear audience, it's an honor to speak at this conference, and it's also an honor to kick off this morning's panel. Here myself. To change that perhaps. Okay, it's also quite an honor to be here this weekend with you all to honor our good friend Rolf. I'm quite in shock, I have to say, and had expected to share many cigarettes and thoughts with him this summer and in the future. Now, okay, many of you know perhaps my research on these topics already. In light of this, I want to focus mostly today on the ubiquity and the force of the various Turkish lessons and models in and for interwar Europe, and especially Germany. Now, as I said in other places, these role model functions, they are a product of perceptions. They're not necessarily reflecting the reality of the historical situation. But then again, sometimes they are quite accurate and reflect well the cynicism of the times. To begin with, after the First World War, it would seem that there were so many issues and topics so urgent that nobody would have the time and the energy to look much beyond the borders of their own country, beyond the borders of Germany, and beyond these core new problems. It seems with the end of the war, with a new system of government, with new borders, and with the Paris peace treaties, a whole another series of troublesome issues had presented themselves. This was not the time to sit back and think about the fate of other peoples and other countries. There is here and in other contexts of our topics often some sort of assumed marginality for broader world history. This, of course, is the product of lots of phases of rewriting of history, and I will come back also to that at the end. But Turkey and the Armenian Genocide were not marginal topics in Germany, not at all. The German public had followed events in the Ottoman Empire closely, at least from the 1890s. The massacres of the Armenians in this decade, in the 1890s, as well as the Young Turk Revolution in the next decade, they were prime news in the German print media at the time. You often had front-page articles and series for days and weeks on end on such topics. There are, of course, multiple reasons for why Germany was indeed interested in Turkey, but suffice it to say, the result was that Germany at large indeed was very much familiar with the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, and the Armenians by the end of World War I, and they had been so for a few decades already. Now, why am I talking about this? Because what happened from 1914 until 1923 in the Ottoman Empire was familiar, was being followed, and was deemed very relevant by a host of historical actors, and the Nazis, of course, were among them. The main point of excitement for sure was the War of Independence led by Ataturk. As I mapped and argued elsewhere, this was a media event of the early Weimar Republic. And especially here, you have newspapers taking part in this from the center to the far right. It was a media event or a sustained media frenzy, which was focused on three sets of questions. The first one was, what is going on in Turkey? And this was quite difficult for a time for them to figure out. Secondly, how were the Turks able to resist their Versailles, their Treaty of Sèvres? And thirdly, why Germans did not do the same, and what was there concretely to learn from these events in Turkey? It was a media event and a frenzy. It involved hundreds, and in some papers, thousands of articles on Turkey in a span of 3.5 years, often front page, often running commentary over weeks. And despite what historical wisdom has repeated over and over, this also was part and led to the so-called beer cellar putsch of the Nazis in the early 1920s. It was not Mussolini and the March on Rome. No, it was Ataturk's war and the setting up of a counter-government in Ankara that was the model. Munich was to be a German Ankara. And this is not just inference by a historian, not just my own interpretation of whatever happened. This is what the Nazis themselves wrote when they mobilized their followers in the weeks before the putsch attempt. And in the months before that, the Nazi press had dismissed the Italian role model as not really applicable to Germany, where, as they claimed, circumstances were different. But as we all know, after the failed putsch in Munich and after the trial, the strategy of the Nazis changes, and then the Italian model is very much applicable. As you might know, in the March of Rome, Mussolini was basically invited into government, and this is exactly what would happen in Germany a decade later as well. So in any case, in the early 1920s, Germans could imagine themselves as in similar circumstances as the Turks. And in these years, you had many articles and cartoons explaining to the Germans how you could learn from the Turks and Ataturk specifically, how to revise a peace treaty. And that was the main topic for them. And how you do it, you don't do it by talk, by normal politics. The only way to do it, and Ataturk had shown it, is by force with weapon in hand, military might and conflict. Turkish revisionism was the main lesson for the center to far right in Germany. It went along with interpretations of events in Turkey, of World War I, more in general, and also broader history. History, they believed, was made through might and violence, through betting all on one card, on playing va-banque, as they called it. These lessons then are also important when it comes to how Hitler executed his wars, the Second World War. It is in this context in which we must understand when Hitler was telling the Turkish ambassador at the beginning of the attack on Poland that now the Germans were copying Ataturk. It is these two contexts, violent revisionism and history by might and force, that also explain why Hitler called Ataturk his guiding light in the darkness of the 1920s in an interview that he gave in 1933. But this was only one part of these lessons people drew from the history and concurrent events in Turkey. The other package of lessons centered on ethnic polities, on what to do with minorities. And if you look at publications from the 1920s and 1930s, especially those from a far right spectrum and also in the Third Reich itself, Turkey is portrayed as a mono-ethnic country. The minorities that actually still existed, the Kurds, the various other minorities in Constantinople, they're just imagined away and don't really exist anymore in this Nazi imagination of the new Turkey. In such publications, and especially in the Third Reich, in Third Reich discourse, Turkey was presented as a model ethnic country, a model Völkisch country. Starting from 1933, the Armenian Genocide is not really openly discussed anymore, but it is still part of this overall Nazi depiction of Turkey. Turkey is often called, quote, the most modern country, end quote, in Nazi speeches and texts. It is not about roads, infrastructure, factories, and such. It is about having rid itself of ethnic minorities. This was also a view of a post-genocidal country, of what can be achieved with genocide. Before 1933, the discussion of the Armenian Genocide was very direct and explicit, also by the Nazis. They clearly saw this as a possible solution to their own perceived ethnic question. And what's more, this is only a product of a much larger debate. In the early Weimar years, and parallel to the debate about the Turkish War of Independence, there was also a debate about the Armenian Genocide in Germany. And it's interesting to note also that these two debates in the very much same time span played out almost independently of one another. The newspaper men could distinguish between what happened under the Young Turks and what was happening now under Ataturk. So they were taking part in parallel, and the debate on the Armenian Genocide was a little bit less extensive than the discussion of the Turkish War of Independence, but still it was a large debate. I would argue it was one of the largest public debates on genocide ever, and definitely the largest until this time. And please remember, this is not taking place anywhere at any point in time. This is taking place in Germany just a decade before Hitler came to power. It took place in the first months and years of the then new Nazi party. There would be much more to say about this debate, and I've done so in the past in other places already. What is important for our context is perhaps only that the Nazis and much of Germany knew about the Armenian Genocide, and that the Nazis clearly admired this solution. Genocide was indeed thinkable and was even propagated in Germany long before the Nazis came to power. And also by other actors, not just the Nazis. My book on this is called Justifying Genocide, precisely because the debate on the Armenian Genocide took a rather nasty turn after the Tellerian trial in Berlin, with many of those on the newspaper spectrum who before denied the facts of the genocide now embraced them and ended up justifying genocide, and not just in and for this case, but in general. And again, it's not just interpretation, inference from historians. A book published in the mid-1920s by a German Jewish author discussing new anti-Semitic movements and developments. In this book, he clearly stated that if the Nazis now followed their Turkish model that they've been discussing, that this would mean the murder of all the Jews of Germany and Austria and the redistribution of their property to the Aryans. Going further and summarizing this rather large debate, way too much here today, but for an audience who perhaps already knows a lot of this already, the main message for the Nazis and for others at this time was actually that you can get away with genocide. Again, playing on also what I mentioned before, what is right in the world is decided by might and violence and power, and not by some clearly defined international system of morals. As I said, there are many examples, and we don't need to get fixated on the famous Hitler quote, who speaks today of the Armenians. We have more sources, and I think indeed better ones. And also there are other contexts we can mention here. For example, we can be quite sure that Heinrich Himmler knew quite a lot about the Armenian genocide before the Third Reich even came into existence. Not only had he been personally interested in Turkey, he had also even thought about emigrating to Turkey after World War I. But there's more. He would share for many years in the 1920s his office at the Nazi headquarters in Munich. He would share this office with a woman who was quite an expert on the Armenian genocide. This was Matilda von Narishta. Her husband had died in the Hitler Putsch. He had saved Hitler when he was shot, and he was walking with him arm in arm, dragged to the ground. This faithful person, he had been a consul in Eastern Anatolia during the war and had tried very hard to save the Armenians in his region and even to get Germany to stop this genocide. This was, as his biographer later wrote, the most important period of Scheubner-Richter's life. So I think it's safe to assume that in these years when Scheubner-Richter's widow and Himmler shared an office in the Munich headquarters of the Nazi Party, they probably would have talked about this topic as well over coffee or tea. Hitler himself had been very much a regular every week at the Scheubner-Richter household before the putsch. He even had his own armchair there. Would they not have talked about it? And even if nobody ever really openly and for a long time talked about this, it was in the news all the time. It was a very current topic for Germany in these very years. And later on, even if people hadn't been around of this debate in the early 1920s, for many good Nazis, if you wanted to read on the people who died for the Nazi movement in the failed Munich putsch attempt, if you wanted to read something on Scheubner-Richter, and you have to remember the Nazi Party celebrated this failed coup attempt every year in the Third Reich with huge processions around Munich, ending up at the place where the putsch had ended back then, where there were monuments erected for the blood martyrs of the Nazi movement, Scheubner-Richter being one of them. So if you wanted to read something about this person in the Third Reich, there was only one book besides Lepsius's book itself with the messages that Scheubner-Richter had sent to the embassy in Constantinople and back home to Berlin. The only other book you could read about him, it was written by his aide and published in the Third Reich. And this book shows Scheubner-Richter as a fighter against genocide, an Armenian version, if you will, of a righteous among the nations. A Nazi blood martyr who was a fighter against genocide in a major book in the Third Reich. This is a complication, I think, that we historians should welcome and appreciate without just explaining it away. Anyway, Turkish models and inspiration were there, indeed quite prominently so, in a series of contexts. It would be strange to leave them out of accounts of interwar Germany and the Nazi period. And yet, this is what we are mostly doing today. Not us, as we are gathered in this conference and in others similar, but after World War II, these connections to the Ottoman Empire, to Ataturk and so on, these connections were still present in narrative histories of the Nazi period, and then later they disappear. So if I'm trying to put something back into the picture, it is something that historically was really there. I'm not trying also to shift blame as some Turkish critics would have it. To put it bluntly, it was not the Turks' fault that they were not properly punished for genocide, and that this then could serve as an inspiration in the interwar period. And it's also not immediately Ataturk's fault that the Nazis constructed their view of the new Turkey as their model, but of course it does build on the ambiguity of politics, both domestic and internationally in this period. Think about this. If indeed Germany was exposed to all the various implications and facts about what genocide means, and they were with all the horrifying details of the fates of the Armenians, then electing a party that was propagating this as a possible solution, this becomes a little bit more criminal. And it's a little bit a counterpoint to the claim that people simply couldn't have known. I mentioned earlier that I feel there is usually this idea that the topic, our topic here, is a bit marginal for the events in other countries for world and European history. When I researched on this German dimension and reception of the Armenian Genocide, I was quite shocked, to be honest. Shocked at just how important this topic was at the time for people not even directly entirely concerned. Of course, the German debate only took place and in such an extensive fashion because indeed Germany was directly concerned with and by the Armenian Genocide. They were not only, at the very least, complicit, they were enablers of this genocide. I thought and think that these debates, the consequences drawn, models developed in interwar Germany, should change the way we see the history of the time and also, and crucially, of the Nazis. I was expecting interesting debates with historians of Nazi Germany on what this all means, and I'm still not quite sure what it all means, and I'm still waiting for such debates until today. In one major international journal for history, my book was reviewed by a very esteemed colleague. I felt very honored. But he is an expert of Germany's colonial genocide. And this was for me, unfortunately, quite a typical allocation of experts. We often play in our niche, and the larger topics that we directly touch upon seem to remain largely unchanged. The Armenian genocide still often is thought of as too complicated, and Turkish denialism simply too successful for this topic to get a place in history writing that it actually had in the past. There was one comment on this research in one of the many obscure online forums where somebody was offended that I had suggested implicitly that the Jews of Germany could have known what Nazi rule would mean for them. Of course, he didn't read the book itself. I just mentioned also a Jewish reaction to all this from the mid-1920s. In any case, I don't think that my research is all that relevant to the question of why Jews didn't or did leave Germany when they did. But I thought that this reaction at least reflected the overall importance of this, our topic for world history. Why else, if this topic wasn't so clear and obvious and known for contemporaries, would the author Franz Werfel have chosen to warn Germany of Hitler with this book on the Armenian Genocide? Werfel knew exactly what he was doing, who he was speaking of and speaking to. Now, we have canceled our concluding panel for this conference, but basically here also my main point for this. We have so much to say about the Armenian Genocide, and we stand on such a firm ground of so much research by all our esteemed colleagues, on such a firm ground that you can build many a building on it. We have a lot to say that is central for the histories of many countries, and I would argue central for the 20th century. I can only hope that we will all be listened to and that this topic will be much more integrated into the broader histories of the 20th century. Otherwise, I believe these histories remain dangerously incomplete. The reasons for this topic feeling so far off, so marginal, is not only the result of a relatively successful century-long propaganda campaign of denialism, it is also to a degree a product of more European, Eurocentric writing of history. in some respects, we must call first also for the inclusion of more Ottoman and Turkish history to also achieve a better inclusion of these topics into world history. It is in this context a little bit baffling that narratives that marginalize the Turks and the Ottomans, for many reasons, many of them surely also anti-Turkish, it is baffling that these then actually aid Turkish denialist efforts. Well then, even if there is already so incredibly much done and achieved, there is much more to do. These topics and these ideas are also one of the last things I discussed with Rolf, and we agreed that we have to continue thinking about these implications for world, European, and also German history. And I think we should continue to do that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stefan, for this fascinating presentation, especially on the German admiration for Turkish violence and revisionism after World War II, and also this model of mono-ethnicity, this Turkish model of mono-ethnicity admired by the Germans, including the genocide on the Armenian people, and the shocking German debate in this time during the 1920s. Maybe you could elaborate a bit more why this expected debate, contemporary debate now today on justified genocide in Germany is not proceeding. What do you think? Where are the deeper reasons for this?
This calls probably for a lot of speculation. We cannot be sure, but you know, I think also one of the it's one of the long lasting effects also of the Historikerstreit, that we are very careful not to shift blame for what has happened. I don't think, you know, that this would such a debate need to entail. I would actually think, you know, a higher awareness for genocide in the 1920s and for the Nazi admiration for such things would actually enhance guilt for the Germans, not deflect it away. But you know, it's difficult actually. I can only speculate. It's also the way our disciplines are set up, also the ways our public remembrance takes place. Turkish friends of mine were shocked to see centennial exhibitions in Germany where the Ottoman Empire was very marginal, somewhere on the sidelines. I'm not quite sure. I would be happy to speculate further.
Okay, thank you very much. Roy, do we have no queries in the live stream, in the chat? So we could open the discussion for our audience. Any question to Stefan, Ihrig right now? It's the opportunity. Maybe if somebody wants to, can also talk from here or from the mic. Yeah, there's a question.
Should I come in?
Mm-hmm.
To the microphone here.
The mic. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Hello, Stefan. I want to pick up one thing you said about your research and that you are still waiting for Holocaust experts to engage and start the debate. So I'm wondering, in the last 2 decades, we have incredible research and publications on the Armenian Genocide, its relevance, your work in the context of European history. So how do you see that the field is shifting, Holocaust and genocide studies? And why, how you explain that the debate that you are waiting after your 2 major books published in 2014 and 2015 didn't pick up the way you expected? Thank you.
I mean, look, to some degree, you know, every historian and every researcher thinks their topic's the most interesting and such. I was mainly waiting for this debate because, you know, what does it really all mean? I don't have the answers for that by myself right away anyway. So look, I would say that in general, when it comes to scholars working on genocide and also comparative genocide, that, you know, our topic, the Armenian genocide, is much more included, and it has become easier also for non-specialists on the Armenian genocide to include the research that exists on the Armenian genocide into their more comparative work. So I think there is some progress there. It's becoming a little bit less harder to include the Armenian genocide in these contexts. What I was interested, not even necessarily Holocaust scholars, but for example, people also dealing with the early Nazi party and other such aspects. I'm not, as I said before, it's very difficult to speculate on how these things develop and who, you know, is interested and is talking about these things. Like I said, you know, we have, I think, achieved a lot of inclusion of the topic in a lot of places, also internationally, of course. To some degree, also, I think we need to push also for more inclusion of the Ottoman Empire in these larger histories and Turkish history in order to get moving on these things. For me, it's quite shocking when you think about it, how various actors in Europe, and not only the Nazis and not only the German far right, we have examples from Hungary. You know, Mussolini called himself basically the Mustafa Kemal of Milano. There are many different other contexts where basically all these events that we are interested in are included in a, let's say, European discourse of the time. And it's strange, of course, that our history writing many, many decades later makes a much clearer distinction between, you know, where is European history playing out and where is Middle Eastern history playing out. So I think my idea is kind of, you know, that this is also a way forward. And especially, you know, if we're talking about a country like Germany, which historically has such close relations to Turkey, has so many people of Turkish background living there, and also of other, let's say, Ottoman backgrounds, you know. I would make the argument, and I will make that somewhere else, that to a large degree, Germany can also be conceived of as a kind of post-Ottoman society, like many other societies. When you think of all the millions of people who come from various countries in the Balkans, North Africa, and the Middle East, who are living in the second, third, and such generation in Germany today. And I think this is also a question when it comes to how to teach such topics in schools. We have to become aware that a lot of people have backgrounds and interests that connect to what we are talking about.
Thank you. More questions to Stefan? Stefan, you also mentioned that maybe the international discussion on these new findings will proceed. You are now located at the University of Haifa. Do you see already any impacts on the contemporary Holocaust research in Israel regarding these findings?
Again, this is also difficult to say, but I would say that there is also more willingness, and not because of my work, because of the work that comes before us and carried out by our colleagues who are also present at this conference, that there is in general a more, what do you say, more visible willingness to engage with this topic than there was before. I mean, the problem is always that, you know, especially for people who feel themselves to be hardcore historians, and, you know, of course, I feel myself part of this group, the comparative angle is difficult. And also when tracing the development, you know, from one genocide to the next, all these things are, of course, very difficult. And there's only so far that you can actually go with these findings. But yeah, I would say in general, there is a more pronounced willingness to engage with these topics. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Final opportunity for more questions to Stefan. Thank you very much, Stefan, again for coming virtually, at least to us. We hope very much that you will be among us for any of the next conferences, that the incidence rates will go down in Israel as elsewhere, and lots of power for your ongoing projects and teaching activities.
Thank you so much.
Okay. We are very good in time.